Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Today, I want to take you on a journey of transformation, courage, and faith. The story of a man who, like many of us, carried fears, doubts, and feelings of inadequacy. However, God saw him differently. He called him to a great mission, to free Israel from its oppressors. Before we begin, I want to invite you to be part of this incredible journey. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any transformative stories like this one. And if this message touches your heart at the end, share it with someone who also needs inspiration. If you've ever felt small, incapable, or insignificant when faced with problems, this story is for you. Because in it we learn that God does not choose the strongest or most prepared, but those who, even with doubts and limitations, are willing to trust and obey. Get ready to discover how the youngest of the house of Manasseh, a hidden farmer, became the leader of one of Israel's greatest victories. Stay with me and see how God transforms the unlikely into an instrument of victory. This is the story of Gideon. I want you to understand what life was like for us in those days. It wasn't just hard, it was desperate. We were a people who had been accustomed to hearing stories about the greatness of God, the Lord who had parted the sea, torn down walls, and given us this land. But now, we lived as if God had abandoned us. For 7 years, the Midianites oppressed us without mercy. 7 years. The Midianites were relentless. They didn't just come to steal, they came to destroy. They expected us to work hard, planting and cultivating the land, but at harvest time they would come in droves, like a swarm of locusts covering the sky. They would invade our land with their camel-riding troops, taking everything they could carry and burning what was left behind. It was as if they wanted to wipe us off the face of the earth. I remember seeing the crops destroyed, the fields empty. I remember the sound of silence after they passed, a heavy silence, full of pain. There was no laughter from children, no songs of joy, just the muffled cries of mothers trying to comfort their hungry children, while frustrated fathers stared at the ground without answers, without hope. We had nowhere to run, so we hid. Cities were abandoned, and caves became our homes. In the dark, sitting by small fires, we murmured prayers to the God who seemed far away. There were nights when we wondered if he was still with us, if he still cared. Why has the Lord forsaken us? Was the question I asked over and over in my heart. I still remember that day, as if it were yesterday. The sun was high, but I was hidden in the wine press, threshing wheat in secret. It was desperate work, because the wine press was not the right place for it. Threshing wheat outdoors was more efficient, but who would dare do that? If the Midianites saw, they would come running to plunder. So there I was, in a cramped, dark place, trying to save what little I had for my family. As my hands worked, my mind was full of thoughts. I thought about the future or lack thereof. I thought about my family, my parents, my brothers. How would we go on living like this? But most of all, I thought about God. Why, Lord? Why do you allow this to happen? Why are you so far away? Then I heard a voice. At first I thought it was my imagination. But when I looked up, I saw a man sitting under the oak tree near the wine press. He was watching me with a disconcerting calm. I can't explain it, but there was something different about him. Before I could say anything, he said,
"The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor."
I was completely confused. Mighty man? Me? That seemed like bitter irony. I was hiding, working like a coward. There was nothing mighty about me. So I answered with what was stuck in my heart. "Ah, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are the miracles our fathers told us about? Why has the Lord abandoned us and given us into the hands of the Midianites?" I was frustrated. It was something I had felt for a long time. How could God be with us when everything around us screamed otherwise? But this man who, I would later realize, was the angel of the Lord, was unmoved by my frustration. He simply said,
Go in your strength and deliver Israel from the hands of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?
I didn't know what to say. Deliver Israel? Me? It didn't make sense. I was just a farmer. I wasn't a leader. I wasn't a warrior. So I responded almost automatically. How can I deliver Israel? My family is the smallest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. He looked at me with a firm look, but also with something I had never felt before, a confidence that seemed to come from another world. And he said,
I will be with you, and you will defeat the Midianites as if they were one man.
At that moment, something began to change inside me. It wasn't like thunder or an earthquake, but like a small flame being lit in a dark place. I was still afraid, still doubting myself, but those words, "See will be with you," resonated in my heart. Maybe, just maybe, God was about to do something greater than I could ever imagine. Even after all that, I still couldn't believe it completely. The angel's words kept ringing, but I needed a sign. So I decided to test it. I prepared an offering, a young goat and some unleavened bread, and took them to him. When I arrived, I placed them on a rock and waited. He told me to pour broth over the offering, soaking it completely. I obeyed, although I didn't understand why. Then he reached out with the staff he was holding and touched the offering. Suddenly, fire came out of the rock and consumed everything. I was paralyzed. At that moment, I realized that I was not standing before an ordinary man. It was the angel of the Lord himself. My heart was seized with fear. I fell to my knees and exclaimed, "Ah, Lord God, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But then I heard his voice again. It was calm, full of mercy.
Do not be afraid. You will not die.
After that, I built an altar right there. I called that place, "The Lord is Peace," because even though I was still afraid, there was an inexplicable peace that filled my heart. I still didn't understand how I would free Israel. I still didn't know how to face what was coming. But that day, I knew one thing: God was with me. And as scary as it was, that was enough to make me take the first step. After that encounter with the angel of the Lord, I figured the next thing I would do would be to face the Midianites. But God had other plans. Before sending me to deliver Israel, he wanted me to fix something inside my own house. One night I heard the voice of the Lord clearly.
Tear down your father's altar to Baal. Cut down the Asherah pole that is next to it, and in its place build an altar to the Lord your God. On this altar offer a sacrifice of your father's second bull.
My heart sank. The altar of Baal was not just any structure. It was deeply rooted in the culture of the people of that time. Many people, including my own family, had turned to Baal for safety and provision in times of despair. Tearing down that altar would not only be an act of obedience to God, it would be a declaration of war against idolatry, something that could cost me my life. Still, I knew I had to obey. The fear was still there, but something stronger was beginning to grow within me. The conviction that if God was with me, I had to trust him, even when I didn't fully understand. I waited until nightfall. I chose 10 trusted servants, and together we walked to the altar of Baal. It was a silent night, but my heart was beating like war drums. Each step felt like a ton of weight. When we reached the site, I set to work in a hurry. We tore down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah pole. In the same place, I built a new altar, this time dedicated to the Lord, and offered the sacrifice he had requested. When I finished, I looked at the altar lit by the fire of the sacrifice and felt something different. It wasn't just the fear that was still there. It was a sense that something had changed. God was taking his place again, starting in my own family. But when the sun rose, chaos began. Baal's altar was destroyed, and the news spread quickly through the village. The people came running in fury.
Who did this?
When they found out I was responsible, they demanded that I be killed. I confess that at that moment, my heart sank. But then something unexpected happened. My father, Joash, stood up to defend me. He said,
If Baal is a god, let him fight for himself. If someone has torn down his altar, let Baal punish him.
My father's words changed everything. The crowd began to disperse, and their fury subsided. For the first time, the people began to question their trust in Baal. And that day, something began to change. I realized that before God delivered Israel, he wanted to restore our faith in him. He wanted us to rid ourselves of the things that had taken his place in our hearts. Tearing down Baal's altar was not just a physical act. It was a symbol that the Lord was once again the center of our lives. It was at that moment that I learned one of the most important lessons of my life. Before we can fight the external battles, we must fight the internal ones. Before I fought the Midianites, I had to fight fear, idolatry, and the influence of the things that had separated us from God. And that was perhaps the hardest battle of all. After I tore down the altar of Baal, things began to change. God was with me, and the faith of the people began to be restored. But there was still a huge problem before us, the Midianites. It was time to gather an army. I sent messengers throughout the region, calling on the men of Israel to join me. To my surprise, 32,000 men answered the call. I confess that I was excited, even though we were outnumbered, for the Midianites numbered over 135 it. At least we had a considerable number of warriors. But then God spoke to me again.
You have too many men.
Too many men. How was that possible? We were outnumbered, but God explained.
If Israel wins with this number, they will be able to say it was by their own strength. I wanted to be clear that this victory comes from me.
I didn't know how to react, but I trusted. So I told the army, "Those who are afraid can go home." And do you know what happened? More than half of the men left. Out of 32,000, only 10,000 remained. But I kept trusting. I thought that was enough, but God spoke again.
There are still too many men. Take them to the water, and I will make a selection.
I obeyed. I took the men to the stream and watched as they drank water. God told me,
Separate those who drink the water with their hands, like dogs lapping, from those who kneel down to drink directly from the stream.
In the end, only 300 men were chosen. Out of 32,000 warriors, we now had only 300. It was impossible not to feel completely powerless against the enemy. But God was teaching me something crucial. Victory would not come from numbers or human strength. It would come from Him. With those 300 men, I began to understand that God doesn't need much to do great things. He only needs hearts willing to trust Him completely. And from that moment on, I knew that if we won, it would be because of God and nothing else. With only 300 men at my side, I confess that fear was still present. I had seen God act in extraordinary ways before, but facing such a large army with so few still seemed impossible. That night, we were camped near the valley where the Midianites were. Their tents covered the land like an endless sea. The sound of their voices, laughter, and footsteps echoed through the air. Every noise seemed to mock our smallness. Everything around me told me that this battle was insane, but something inside me whispered, "Trust." Still, God knew my heart. He knew the doubts that haunted me. Then, He spoke to me.
If you are still afraid, go down to the camp with your servant Purah. Listen to what they are saying, and it will strengthen your heart.
That invitation was unexpected. God was telling me that even my insecurity was part of His plan. So Purah and I crept closer to the enemy camp. The silence of the night was broken only by the sound of the sentries and the soldiers talking. Hidden in the shadows, we heard two soldiers talking. One of them said,
"I had a dream. A barley loaf rolled across the camp and knocked over a tent with such force that it fell."
The other replied,
"That can only mean one thing. God has delivered the army of Midian into the hands of Gideon the Israelite."
I could hardly believe what I was hearing. God was not only preparing us, but had already sown fear and defeat in the hearts of the enemy. At that moment, something changed inside me. It was not just the certainty that we would win. It was the certainty that this battle was already God's, and I was just an instrument in His hands. I returned to our small camp with a heart full of courage and said to my men, "Get up. The Lord has delivered the camp of the Midianites into our hands." We were ready to act, trusting completely in God. As I planned the battle, I wondered how 300 men could defeat such a large army. But God had already prepared everything. He did not need human weapons. He needed our obedience and our faith. Then He gave me a strategy that to human eyes seemed crazy. I called the men together and divided them into 3 groups of 100. I explained the plan God had given me. Each man would be given a trumpet, a clay pitcher, and a torch. There would not be enough swords or spears for all of us. Our strength would not come from steel, but from the confidence that the Lord was with us. Night fell, and silence reigned around the valley where the army of Midian was encamped. Their tents spread out like an endless sea, and the sound of voices and footsteps filled the air. They did not suspect that in the darkness, 300 men were positioning themselves for an attack that would change everything. Each group took up their positions at strategic points around the camp. No one spoke, no one made a sound. Only the wind blew softly, bringing with it the tension of the night. It was almost unbearably quiet, but I knew that God's presence was with us. When everything was ready, I raised my trumpet and blew it with all my might. The sound cut through the silence like thunder, echoing through the valley. It was a loud, intimidating sound, and it seemed to come from an army much larger than the 300 men who were there with me. Then all the others blew their trumpets. The sound was deafening, as if thousands of warriors were advancing. After that, we broke the clay jars that hid the torches, and their lights shone in the darkness like stars surrounding the camp. Then we shouted in unison,
For the Lord and for Gideon.
What happened next was something that only God could have done. The Midianites woke up in complete panic. In the darkness, disoriented by the sound of the trumpets and the light of the torches, they thought they were surrounded by a huge army. Fear took hold of them. They began to attack each other. In the confusion, no one knew who was friend or foe. Soldiers fled their tents, screaming and running in all directions. The swords that were supposed to be used against us were now used against each other. It was complete chaos. Meanwhile, we, the 300, remained in our positions, watching everything happen. It was like watching a storm that had been unleashed by God Himself. We did not raise a sword. We did not need to. The battle was not ours. It was His. The sound of trumpets and the brightness of torches were our only weapons. But God used them to turn the night into a victory that no one could deny. It was not human strength that was at stake here. It was the power of God, and He was showing everyone that true strength comes from Him. By the time the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the battlefield was silent. The panicked cries of the Midianites had faded, replaced by a heavy silence. Many of them had fled, leaving behind their weapons, supplies, and what was left of their dignity. But the battle was not yet completely over. God had begun the work, but now it was our turn to pursue those who were fleeing. With the few resources we had, we began to pursue the remnants of the Midianite army. As we ran through the desert, other men of Israel, who had previously been hiding and afraid, began to join us. They heard about what God had done, and their courage was renewed. By the end, there were no longer just 300 of us. We were an army united by faith in the Lord, and determined to ensure that the Midianites would never oppress us again. The pursuit was long and arduous. Each step seemed heavy, but the certainty that God was guiding us gave us the strength to continue. With each group of enemies we defeated, more people joined our cause. The news spread quickly throughout Israel.
God has given victory to Gideon and his 300 men.
Finally, after days of pursuit, the last remnants of the Midianite army were defeated. I looked out over the valley that had once been filled with tents and enemy soldiers. Now it was just an empty field, marked by the signs of a victory no one could have imagined. When we returned home, we were greeted with celebration. The people of Israel were jubilant, not only because they were free from the oppression of the Midianites, but because they knew that this victory was not of man. It was of the Lord. As the shouts of joy echoed around me, my heart was filled with gratitude. Not because we had defeated such a large army, but because God had used our weakness to demonstrate His strength. He showed everyone that victory does not come from swords or numbers, but from trusting in Him. That moment was etched in our hearts. It was a living reminder that God is faithful and powerful to save. No matter how impossible the situation may seem, with God, nothing is impossible. He is able to transform the smallest forces into instruments of His greatest victories. After the battle, Israel experienced something they had not known for a long time: peace. For 40 years, we lived without fear of the Midianites. The lands that had been devastated began to flourish again. Families who had been hiding in caves were able to return to their homes. But more importantly, our faith was restored. Many people came to me and said,
"Gideon, rule over us."
Be our king, you and your sons after you.
Because you freed us from the Midianites.
But I knew that the victory was not mine. It was not about my leadership or strength. So I answered, "I will not reign over you, nor my sons. The Lord will reign over Israel." This was the greatest lesson of all for me, that no matter what we face or what victories we win, it all comes from the Lord. He is our true King, our deliverer. Over the years, I have told this story to my children and grandchildren. I have reminded them of how God chose someone as unlikely as me to lead Israel. How He used 300 men with pitchers and torches to defeat an unbeatable army. I wanted them to know that God does not choose the strongest, but those who trust in Him. And now, I want you to know this too. No matter how small or incapable you feel, God can use you in ways you never imagined. If He did it for me, He can do it for you. The peace we have experienced for 40 years has been a gift from God, not because we were perfect, but because we have learned to trust Him. May this story inspire you to do the same. If this story touched your heart, I want to invite you to be part of this journey of faith and inspiration. Don't forget to like this video. It helps us bring these messages to more people. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories, and, of course, share it with friends, family, or anyone you think needs to hear about God's power to transform lives. And now it's your turn. Write here in the comments which biblical hero you would like to see us tell in the next videos. It could be Moses, David, Deborah, Esther, or any other character that has inspired you. Who knows? Maybe your suggestion will become the theme of our next episode. We look forward to hearing from you. May God bless you, and see you in the next video. The Lord is our peace, and with Him there is no battle impossible to win.